Welcome back to another episode of the Max Turn Podcast. Kyle Stitch here alongside James Finch, and today we continue our season preview, kind of talking a little bit about over/under point totals, a little bit fantasy. We continue in the Eastern Conference with the Atlantic Division, and we're going to kind of give our thoughts, opinions on where we stand. The Atlantic Division is thought of as one of the tougher divisions in hockey. We'll kind of get into that a little bit more in this episode. If you have any thoughts, questions, wanna support us, follow us at AFP Analytics on Twitter. You can find our personal accounts there as well. We're always happy to interact with anyone who has questions, give some advice, stuff like that. We're not fantasy or betting experts or anything, but we're happy to offer an opinion or act as a sounding board. In that same realm, we're going to talk about point totals, what we might do, but these aren't necessarily going to be based on like projections. They're definitely not guaranteed by any means, so don't take our money, our ideas, risk your own money if you're not comfortable losing it, or being like, we're not guaranteeing wins or anything, so know that whatever you choose based on our opinions is your choice, not ours. We're offering what we might do. And we're referencing point totals. We're not necessarily sponsored by any betting site or anything like that. We just pulled them from a popular site, and that's all I'll say on that. But hey, if you do work for a betting company and wanna hook up with us, you can find us on any of those places. Any other ads or anything that you might hear associated with this episode are also not necessarily products that we're working with, endorsing, or anything like that. And yeah, we appreciate you listening, subscribing to this podcast on all major platforms. And with that, the Atlantic Division, we're going to do this. If you missed our first episode, we started with the Metropolitan Division. We did that in kind of order from lowest projected point total to highest. We kind of broke the ties if they had the same point total, who we think is going to finish higher. So we're going to do the same thing here. Atlantic Division, lowest projected point total. Montreal Canadiens, 71.5. I'll be straight up. I like the over.
Yeah, so do I. Like you said, we covered the Metropolitan Division already. We're going to do the Atlantic right now. Of those two divisions, so the Eastern Conference, the point totals we have here have Montreal being the worst team in the Eastern Conference. I disagree. You were pretty confident just now saying you definitely take the over. I am also right there with you, definitely taking the over. I think they're a team that everyone thinks is supposed to be really bad, and I don't think that's actually the case. At the same time, I'm not trying to say that they're going to be really good and make the playoffs. I don't believe that either, personally. But there's enough talent here that they should not be the worst team in the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, and here I'll start this episode off with a maybe blazing hot take. I might like them more than the Detroit Red Wings. I wouldn't be surprised if they finished ahead of a Detroit, even in Ottawa. I mean, sure, I think the other teams would need a lot of other things to go wrong for them, but I don't even think it's a lock they finish last in the division. I like their roster on paper.
Yeah.
Their forward group's solid. Defensively is definitely a little bit or a big question mark, but I mean, again, they got youth. Maybe some of those guys take a step forward. I think David Reinbacher, who they picked in the first round in the most recent draft, if he can come on, make an instant impact, you don't see it a ton from 18-year-old defensemen, but he's been playing in European leagues against men that maybe he can make that transition.
Yeah, in a perfect world, that would happen. Like you said, it doesn't happen too often though. So I don't think that should really be the expectation for Montreal. They do have some younger players there that we would hope to see a little bit of a step taken. Um, And in a perfect world, that would allow for some veterans like a Michael Matheson, a David Savard to not be playing as big of a role as, say, first pair defensemen. I think at their absolute best, those guys should be on the second pair. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's definitely room to improve defensively if we're looking at their defensemen here. And if we're going to see growth, it's going to be from those younger players.
I think they did make a level of improvement. They didn't really have the cap space to do a lot this offseason, but I think they were savvy. They were able to get Sean Monahan back, which should help. And then again, it's their young players. You hope Caulfield can come back healthy, get back to where he is. I think the big question mark is Yuri Slavkovsky, who's a year removed at this point from being the first overall pick. You need to start to see progress from him, and I guess I would feel more comfortable thinking that will happen because that's generally what happens with guys who are taken that high. But then last episode we talked about the Rangers, and they have two guys that haven't done it yet. And Slavkovsky and Kaapo Kakko are not dissimilar players, so they're until he does it, there's still always going to be a little bit of a question mark in my mind for him.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that first year this past season was a little bit, I guess I'll just say underwhelming for a first overall pick. Um, but like you're saying, he's young. He's 19. That was just his first year. There is room for improvement. Does it definitely happen? No, but if we're trying to make an educated guess, look at this roster, where could things improve, or I guess just where can things go right for them, and we're trying to make a educated decision on a over under. That's a specific area, a specific player actually that should see a little bit of improvement and ultimately help the team out offensively.
Yeah, depending on what type of, if you're playing fantasy hockey, depending on what type of capacity, how deep the roster leagues, what type of format, but Slavkovsky would be someone I'd probably look at rolling the dice on. Like, I think he's worth the risk. I think he's worth the risk if you're doing some level of draft, you can kind of sneak him a little bit later. Like, he's going to get power play opportunities. He's going to get top 6 minutes. He's probably going to play with a pretty decent center. Like Nick Suzuki, Kirby Dach are likely going to be their top two. Christian Dvorak's also in that mix. Like, they have three pretty good centers. So Slavkovsky is someone I'd roll the dice on. Cole Caulfield's probably going high, but Caulfield's another player that should score some goals this year.
Yeah, and just looking at it from the team's perspective and how many points that we think they're going to have. Cole Caulfield only played 46 games last year because of his injury. That's pretty significant when we're trying to evaluate a team. He's a top line forward for them and a goal scorer at that. So that should really be another player, another spot for improvement. Another player they acquired, Alex Newhook from the Colorado Avalanche. Kind of underwhelmed so far in his career with the Avalanche. Kind of gets thrown into a new situation here. Very comparable to Kirby Dach moving from Chicago to Montreal. And really last season, Kirby Dach, he didn't go crazy and play at a point per game pace or anything like that, but he started to look much more like that higher draft pick. Okay, this guy should be turning into a top 6 center now. Could that happen for a guy like Alex Newhook? Maybe. It's a question mark, but there's potential there as well.
Yeah, I think the theme with the Canadians is the ceiling could be higher than I think people are thinking. The floor could certainly be lower as well, but so their range of outcomes could be pretty far, but they have enough guys with pedigree, draft status, maybe just staying healthy, that they're a team that could catch some teams by surprise if they could get off to a hot start. Again, I don't know if I'd say they're a playoff team, but could be kind of that pesky team that stays around a little longer than everyone's thinking, especially if they can get off to a good start this year.
Yeah, if you're looking to kind of pick out which teams might play spoiler towards the end of the season, I don't think Montreal is just going to be that team you can, I'll say, skate right over and it's an automatic win. They're going to cause some issues, I think, for some teams.
And one thing I referenced a lot in the last episode where we recorded is kind of thinking about where they might be at the trade deadline, because that plays a big role in kind of how teams finish, which really impacts when we're talking low point totals like Montreal at 71.5. I would expect them to probably stand pretty much pat.
Yeah, and I'll expand on that slightly. I think even if they were to say, okay, we're willing to sell to an extent, I don't really know. Like, I guess maybe Sean Monahan, if he's healthy, he could be someone they trade to a contender. But a lot of their top players are expected to be in Montreal for the long term. Cole Caulfield, Nick Suzuki. Um, there's Josh Anderson on the wing, which I would trade him if I was them, if there was a trade available. Um, but you look at Kirby Dach, Brendan Gallagher is a long-term piece for Montreal. He's one of their top leaders. I don't think they view him as a veteran that they'd want to move. And then you start going down the lineup. Alex Newhook, they just acquired him. They're kind of looking to see if they're the right fit for him. A winger that came up at the end of last season actually played very well for them. Harvey Pinard, young player, you're not trading him. Jake Evans, center, maybe they could move him, but he's been a good young bottom six guy. A lot of their players are young. They're not players you really flip at the deadline. So I think even if they decided they were willing to sell, I don't think there's much that they could subtract from their team that really would change the type of team they are after the deadline.
Yeah, I guess my name's for that potentially. David Savard, he has 2 years left, so he would be more than just a deadline rental, but he could be someone a contender is interested in he's a good veteran defenseman on a reasonable contract. I mean, Christian Dvorak's name's been in the rumor along with Josh Anderson for a little while, but as you were saying, those guys aren't making or breaking probably their final outcome. So, I mean, I wouldn't be. It comes down to I'm not concerned with their deadline action impacting how they finish this season, and I think that's the important thing when thinking about sprinkling some money here. I feel much more comfortable placing an over bet on a team like that than some other team that might go either way depending on how their season's going leading up to that. So I already hot taked that maybe I like Montreal better than Detroit. That was a true hot take. I don't know if I'd 100% bet Detroit less than 86.5. I think I lean that way. But that's probably right around where Detroit finishes. I don't know. I don't know how many times we've sat here and talked about Detroit and how they haven't done enough, kind of ragged on them a little bit, but I still look at their roster and it's still very underwhelming for where they should be.
Yeah, so thinking back to our different episodes during kind of the heart of the off season where all the free agency news is going on, different trade speculation and everything. When we talked about Detroit, the big thing every time we were talking about them, they need to find goal scoring. they added some players. Alex DeBrincat is adding goal scoring. When that move went down and we discussed it, we still looked at this roster and said they kind of need more goal scoring. They didn't really get that beyond Alex DeBrincat. So they tried to improve that area, but I don't know if they really did it to the extent that they needed.
They're a team I honestly just worry about the vision, the Yzer plan, if you will.
Yeah.
Dylan Larkin, absolutely top line center. Alex DeBrincat, really good scoring winger. David Perron can score some goals. He's also 35 years old. Lucas Raymond's a nice, young, exciting player who should continue to ascend forward. But then after that, I don't know. It's a lot of middle six guys. You want to count on Daniel Sprong having another 20 to 30 goal season. Like, that's where I think we get to, because Andrew Kopp, JT Compher are really nice middle six players, but ideally they're your elite third line, basically your elite third line. Top prospect in the probably closest to coming up in the, at least in the forward group, is Marco Kasper, who projects to be a very solid overall NHL player, but again, he projects to be more of that middle, maybe third line, elite two-way type of player that they already have enough of. Like, they could roll out the best third line in hockey of Kopp, Compher, and Marco Kasper, and great, but where's the goal scoring going to come from?
So this team, the way they're kind of built, I almost want to call them like a New York Islanders light. They don't have like a real high scoring potential. A lot of the players, the type of hockey that they're good at playing, is going to be more of that defensive lockdown type of game. The JT Compher, Andrew Kopp. I just, yeah, I don't really see where, when we're looking at teams and we're saying, okay, what could go really well, really right for them this season? I guess maybe Lucas Raymond takes a step forward and scores 30. And that would be pretty significant. That's a big deal if that happens. But I don't know if him taking a step forward gets him that far. I don't really see, similar to the Islanders, I don't really see where the opportunity is on this roster for more scoring. And differently from the Islanders, they are not as strong defensively.
Yeah, that was, if you didn't say it, I was going to say it, because Mo Seider is very good. Seems like he's continuing to ascend, but also I don't think he's quite broken into that top tier defenseman threshold that you're seeing some of these other guys around the league break into. I've learned this offseason, Jake Wallman's a sneaky kind of good defensive defenseman. Like, he's a sneaky good all-around player. They have Simon Edvinsson, who's right now might be in the AHL because of other decisions made. Like, looking at their defensemen outside of Wallman and Seider, they have Ben Sherratt, Shane Gostisbehere, Justin Holl, Ole Mata, Jeff Petrie. I don't know where Simon Edvinsson is slotting in.
Yeah, I agree. And at the same time, I want to point out that you just named 5 players who I think ideally would be on a good bottom pair.
Yes, and I wasn't going to say it. I was going to see your reaction first, but yes. Yeah, they have the best third pair in hockey.
The best 2 third pairs in hockey, maybe. That sounds weird. Doesn't quite make sense. That's kind of the point. And even touching back on Seider and Wallman, I think Seider has a great future. Like you said, I don't think he's quite in that, let's say, number one defenseman group, but I think he could very well end up there, possibly even this season. Jake Wallman is that very underrated defensive defenseman. Those are two great players to have. I don't know if they are quite that elite top pair put together, at least at this moment in time. They could end up that, but I just don't think they're there yet. And when you add that on top of having a handful of decent third pair defensemen, you're kind of missing the higher end depth.
Realistically, their forward group and defensive group are very similar in that there's a couple guys that you're comfortable with playing towards the top of your lineup, and then it's just a bunch of kind of more bottom lineup pieces that you're trying to fill in and make work throughout, I guess. And then, I mean, another place they're nowhere near as good as the Islanders is goalies. Ville Husso, James Reimer, Alex Lyon. Maybe we see a little Sebastian Cossa this year. Probably not. I mean, Ville Husso, I guess, is the one. I've seen him get lit up enough times where he's fine, but again, you want to take a step forward. That's not inspiring.
No, and unless you somehow sneak into the playoffs and he turns into Adin Hill for the playoffs, which is very rare, I would say, for a goalie to go on that type of run without that type of really strong play throughout a regular season. Husso's probably like a pretty good 1B. Issue is they don't have a 1A. They have a backup, James Reimer.
Maybe Alex Lyon's a 1B, but I mean,
I would even say Alex Lyon. I actually, like, this offseason, I kind of highlighted him as a free agent. If you need a good backup, go get Alex Lyon. But I think he's just that. He's a good backup. So I almost kind of question having Reimer and Lyon. I think teams are trying to have a bit more goalie depth. I think we've kind of seen it in the past year or two. More teams are trying to carry 3 goalies. So I guess maybe that's fine, but none of these 3 are moving the needle in a positive way of, like, that guy's going to go win you a lot of games. We kind of just went through forwards, defensemen, and goalies, and I think we're ultimately just kind of deciding this lineup's underwhelming.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, if I say the Detroit Red Wings are going to get 87 points, if I say that out loud, I don't know how I get there. I don't know how I believe that, because 87 points is a team that's right in the playoff hunt to the tail end of the season. And looking at this roster, I mean, they're going to be pesky, they're going to be annoying just like the Islanders, but I just don't know how I can get to 87 points with this roster. If they're kind of out of it, David Perron, who might be one of their better scoring players, is going to be an attractive trade deadline piece that could get moved out. Shane Gostisbehere, same thing. So, again, if they're not quite there, they also might tail off a little bit at the end of the season. So, I think I'm leaning under. I don't feel great about it, but again, saying 87 points out loud for the Detroit Red Wings just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, and I want to point out that I mentioned when we first started talking about the Red Wings, they did overall, I guess, improve goal scoring when they brought in Alex DeBrincat. at the same time, we don't feel that that's really enough. And I think in a division like this, which is who you're playing the majority of your games against, this division has other up and coming teams, um, as well as some teams that have been known to be the top teams in hockey in the past decade. So it's not like Detroit bringing in DeBrincat improves goal scoring. Okay, but it's not like that's all that happened this offseason. There are other teams similarly trying to reach the playoffs, and I think that kind of makes it tough to say, well, when we feel overall they're underwhelming still, are they really going to reach um, that 86 and a half? I don't think so. I honestly think I would take the under. Um,
Yeah, I think we're both leaning under here. I will say I think if you're looking for maybe a little bit of an under radar player for them, Mo Sider is going to get opportunities to put up points. So if you're looking for a pure fantasy like a defenseman that might be a sneaky nice addition, Mo Sider is going to get power play time with their best scorers, and he's going to play with the best scorers the Detroit Red Wings have. So he's going to put up points in. I mean, again, looking at their roster outside of Shane Gostisbehere, they don't have someone else who's even going to challenge him for those scoring opportunity minutes, basically.
yeah, Gostisbehere will be your power play 2 quarterback, but he's not going in front of Sider. So, yeah, Sider's definitely going to have that opportunity. So, from a fantasy perspective, like you said, uh, definitely keep an eye on Sider.
So it's interesting that there's now a pretty like odds wise or point projection wise, there's a 5 point gap between Detroit and Ottawa, who's next. 91.5 for Ottawa, who everyone wants to buy into, I think. They have some nice young players to bring it out. Tarasenko in, Chychrun for a whole season, have Sanderson now locked up long term. Korpisalo in goal, maybe getting Josh Norris back healthy. And then again, young players that you're hoping to take a step forward. Dominik Kubalik in as well. But, I mean, I don't know. 91.5 points is pretty ambitious there.
I think it's a little ambitious. I think the real question is so they're young players who are really supposed to be their top guys. I feel like they've already kind of reached that level. So Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stutzla, I feel like people knew he was having a good season, but I don't know if people fully realized that he had a 90-point season. Um, he is a first line center. As far as improvement, I guess maybe he could improve on that, but I'm not so sure. He's already at 90 points. He's your first line center. Joshua Norris didn't really play much last year. Had a shoulder injury, so I guess he's maybe someone who could positively impact the season. Drake Batherson as well. Um, I want to touch on the Alex DeBrincat moving out, Tarasenko moving in. I've mentioned this to you, and I feel like we're kind of on the same page. Let's call it a transaction. That transaction of DeBrincat out, Tarasenko in. I think you're just hoping Tarasenko kind of provides the same as what DeBrincat did. You're not hoping for improvement. You're hoping you're breaking even. Chychrun for a full season, like you mentioned, that should be really good, especially for players like Thomas Chabot, Jake Sanderson. Someone of Chychrun's caliber defensively coming into the lineup, I think that over a full season, it's going to make their defensive play stronger. So I guess I like that for them. Their defense looks good going into the season. I'm not really confident in their goalies.
Yeah, I will say I'm probably more bullish on Tim Stützle than you are. I picked him up a couple of times going into last season for some fantasy purposes, and that worked out real nicely for me. I think he could easily become a 100-point player. Like he's an elite center. I think if he's in a different market, I hate to say it, he's talked about more.
Yeah.
But again, is that enough? I don't know, but
I think that's more what I was getting at. Let's say he goes from 90 points to 100 points. There's value there, but I don't know if it's enough that really pushes them much further forward. He's already providing stellar play. Is 10 more points impacting a whole lot? Maybe a little bit. Where I would say maybe keeping a DeBrincat over a Tarasenko might positively impact you more. I guess I'm more just looking at their roster and kind of saying it's good. I don't know if they're really improved from last year too much.
And again, that goalie situation is, I mean, Jonas Korpisalo at times has proven to be a really good starter, and at other times has proven to not be a really good starter. And then once you then you're looking at Anton Forsberg, Mag Sogard. I mean, it's a roll of the dice, like, with their goaltending situation. So I guess I could see a scenario where Ottawa does get 92, even pushes playoffs. But really, if they're going to hit their over-under, they're basically going to have to be a playoff team. And again, in a tough conference where just seems like last season they had stretches where they just went cold and they couldn't get through things. I don't know. I lean under here, but I think I could be talked into an over with Ottawa, but maybe that's buying the same thing that's been sold every year with the Senators recently.
Yeah, I think I ultimately lean under. And honestly, I don't know if there's a whole lot else to say on the team. I don't know. I don't think they improved quite enough based off of last year, and I don't know if I don't know how much space is really there for their current players to really take a step forward. Brady Tkachuk's a first line winger. Stützle's first line center. Norris and Batherson are your other top six guys. Giroux hopefully is still the same player. He could start declining. So I think depending on what numbers you look at too, you could argue he's starting to already decline. I guess I'm not convinced they're much of a different team than they were last year. So I think I lean under. If I had to bet, which I'm not comfortable about it really, but if I had to, I think I lean under 91.5.
Speaking of teams that are basically the exact same, next on the list, the Buffalo Sabres, 92.5, basically right where they finished last year. Their, I guess, offseason consisted of Craig Anderson retiring, trading Ilya Lyubushkin after signing Connor Clifton and Eric Johnson. So, one right shot defenseman out, two right shot defensemen in, a goalie retiring, and I guess you could consider Devin Levi as an addition, but he was there at the end of the year. So, outside of Levi there for the full season and swapping Lyubushkin for Clifton, this team's basically the same. Oh, and Jack Quinn's going to miss probably half the year.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start with talking about Devin Levi. He is basically an addition. He did look pretty good in the 7 games he played at the end of the year. Those are his only 7 pro games. What's the expectation for him? Before answering that, okay, they've got Eric Comrie. Well, we know Eric Comrie is probably a good backup. Not much more than that. They've also got UPL, Ukko Pekka. At this point, probably a good backup. We'd like to see him take a step forward, but we've kind of been saying that. We said it last year, a little bit the year before. So maybe he's still young. He could take another step. But I think the default answer here is Devin Levi's the starter. He has crazy potential. Maybe he does have crazy potential, but how confident are we that he's gonna play well, let's say 45 games in the season and really be a starter? I I guess as Buffalo, you really hope so, but that's a very questionable situation in that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also argue that maybe Luukkonen could steal some games. There were moments last year he did, and then moments he probably gave some games away.
Yeah.
Eric Comrie did not steal games, probably did give some away. Maybe getting healthy, maybe getting comfortable with the system that's being played in front of him might help. But yeah, I mean, I'll say placing an over bet at 92.5 points with just that goalie situation is. I don't feel real comfortable putting any, and if I'm putting money, I'm sprinkling a little bit there. It's definitely not something I feel real comfortable with. And like I think one of the arguments that was made is, well, they're going to improve the blue line play in front of those goalies. So sure, they brought in Clifton and Erik Johnson, shipped out Ilya Lyubushkin, but I think I've been on record on this podcast saying that I don't know if that's good enough. Like, there might be a marginal improvement, but I'm not even comfortable saying there's a marginal improvement because Lyubushkin, when he was seemed to be healthy, had some good stretches of hockey. I mean, they're always like you could bet on him taking a penalty every game and basically get free money there. But he plays some good hockey in stretches, and are they really going to get this much better out of Clifton and or Erik Johnson? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think going into the offseason, a big thing for Buffalo was maybe trying to improve your top 4 defensemen. So Dahlin, Samuelson, Owen Power, Jokiharju is pretty much your number 4, or at least he has. I think on paper, looking at it, it's okay. Ideally, he slides down to the bottom pair and probably is a pretty decent bottom pair defenseman in that role. Neither of these defensive additions were guys that I really circled thinking Buffalo should be targeting these two. Connor Clifton was a pretty solid bottom pair defenseman for the Boston Bruins. I don't want to take that away from him. Good penalty killer. But now we're signing him away from a very good team, which is something I want to make sure we say. He played on a very, very good team. So we're taking the very good team's bottom pair defenseman, and are we putting him into the top 4 now, hoping he replicates that play? If that's the case, I have questions. If he's a bottom pair guy for Buffalo, okay, I guess, but that's not really what we needed to see from Buffalo. Erik Johnson, I think, brings a level of a leadership component that they didn't really have. Kyle Poso's a really solid leader, so is Zemgus Girgensons. Erik Johnson just won a cup. He is a veteran defenseman, which they didn't really have a veteran defenseman who has had real success in his career, like Erik Johnson has. So I kind of get that move from a leadership aspect. But again, if I'm looking at the roster, I would see Erik Johnson's name and I would pencil him in as my seventh defenseman based on his play last year. So I guess to wrap up my thoughts on this defense, I don't think they added the defenseman they needed to add.
Yeah, and I think that's the what we were on record earlier this offseason. Radko Gudas was out there. He was out there. He didn't yes, he's a little bit older than Connor Clifton. He didn't come in much higher cost-wise than Connor Clifton, and he would have basically played the role that you got two guys to he's got experience. He was just on he didn't lift the cup, but he was just on a team that made the Stanley Cup Finals in the Florida Panthers, and he's a really good second pair defenseman. That was out there for you without having to give up assets or anything and just spending a little bit more money. So again, age maybe was a little concern, but you could have addressed, I think, your need with one player instead of kind of rolling the dice on two, and now you're really in the same situation. You have, again, those three really good defensemen, Dahlin, Samuelsson, Power. Could they carry you? Absolutely. But then, again, you have Yoki Haru, Clifton, Erik Johnson, Jacob Riesland, Riley Stillman to fill out your lineup, and none of those names are inspiring for, in tandem with the goalie question mark, for a true playoff team. But if the Sabres are going to overcome those deficiencies, it's going to be by just outscoring opponents with offensive firepower, because they have forwards who can score goals.
Absolutely. It's by far the obvious strength of the team. We saw a lot last season. Skinner, Thompson, Tuck. You see combinations kind of differing and changing, but there's Dylan Cousins, JJ Paterka, Jack Quinn. Casey Middlestat really came on towards the end of the year, to the point where he had some questionable seasons, and now you're kind of thinking maybe we can really rely on Casey Middlestat as a very good middle six and real solid player that can play up in the lineup if needed. Issue being, one of those names I mentioned just now is going to miss a bit of time here for the Sabres. And it's also someone who would have been expected to take a step forward off of what was already a very solid season, Jack Quinn.
And on Quinn, the injury is going to be coming off of an Achilles injury. Even if he's on the ice in the timeline that was expected, that's sometimes not an injury that you come back the same level, especially quickly from. I'm not saying that it's a career devastating injury, but sitting here counting on him to be a solid contributor at all this season, I feel like a little bit of a stretch, which is probably why they never traded Victor Olofsson, who seemed to be on the trade block for much of the summer, and then that went quiet once the Jack Quinn injury kind of came to light.
Yeah, I mean, Olofsson was on record himself saying, or maybe it was his agent, I don't remember if it specifically came from him, but they were expecting he was going to be traded this offseason. And I think truly going into the offseason, that was probably the plan, but it definitely made sense to probably hold off on that for now with Quinn going out. So I kind of want to switch the thinking here to Buffalo's an up and coming team. Where's the improvement coming from with them?
Yeah, and I think that's the really the important question because earlier this offseason, I tweeted it out. I don't remember if I mentioned it on one of these episodes. I did a quick. There was a question posed on Twitter. Would the Sabres be about the same team based on like their scoring and goals allowed, and if they scored a little bit less? And I simulate out like 10,000 Buffalo Sabres seasons based on the goals they scored and goals they allowed last year and got to basically the exact same spot. So we're pretty much said that Clifton for Labushkin is maybe a small net positive, probably a level of injury, a little miss in Jack Quinn's probably a little bit of a negative. So where's the step forward come from? Well, they need their young players to continue to improve, which is not out of the realm of possibilities and by any means. I think if there's one name I'd circle to maybe have that breakout year this year, JJ Paterka, he's a guy that I would, if you're playing some fantasy hockey, I try and stash on your roster.
Yeah, so he really showed some flashes. There were times where just seeing him skate up the ice, and you were like, "Wait a minute, there's another level in his game for sure." Like you could see it. At the same time, we didn't always see that. There were games where you were kind of like, "Where's Paterka?" Um, that happens with young players. That was his rookie season. That I think is a spot where Buffalo can say we expect a step forward this year and a little bit more of some offensive output from Paterka. I want to touch back and reiterate with Casey Middlestat. He was pretty much a different player post deadline, and if he can keep that up and kind of turn into that's just who he is, that's going to be an improvement for the team over the full season. There's space to improve for Dylan Cousins from I would say, a defensive consistency point of view. Um, One spot we've kind of talked about where is there maybe a little regression heading his way. Tage Thompson, 47 goals. That's not easy to replicate and do 2 seasons in a row. And it's not at all to say he's not capable of it, but does he get there again? Does he continue that play? I don't know. He finished with 94 points. It wouldn't shock me to see if he had 85 this coming season.
He could get to 100, but
Yep.
it could come through more assists. Like, yeah, I think really the struggle with the Sabres, they're a trendy pick to be a playoff team. They're a trendy pick to kind of maybe an over, but I don't know if I would feel comfortable putting money on that as I kind of started this. It's really looking for young players, maybe one of their prospects as well, to slot into the lineup and take a step forward and really add something. But just their overall roster, I think they finished where they probably should have last year. But they got some good games out of Craig Anderson, shockingly, like at his age. They might not get those games this year. There's questions in goal, and then just their overall roster. Like, they had an opportunity to make a clear upgrade. They didn't. Jack Quinn injury. I think they probably finished right around the same point total. So whether I don't know where I would bet, but like it should be an easy, based on the cap space they had and where they knew their team was going. This should be an easy over bet because they should have made a move, but they didn't. They didn't get there.
Yeah, I think that's another thing to point out here. Buffalo Sabres, as of today, per cap friendly, or I should say, as of us recording this, 8.7 in cap space, 8.7 million. There's a lot of space there. I think maybe I would like to see them be a little more aggressive this year as far as when trade deadline season's around. If you're right on the edge, let's make a little bit of a push maybe. Um, Maybe you grab a rental. I think the overall impact that that really has, I don't think it's as big as most people think it is. I almost think it's more of a mindset move for the team itself. I think it might just bring a little more energy, and that's really where the impact is. But yeah, I mean, they really should have made. It, I don't want to say a significant move, but I almost lean towards a significant move, at least in the sense of a top four defenseman, a starting goaltender, maybe a middle six forward once Quinn went down. Um, and they just didn't. It's another team that's relatively the same as they were the prior year.
Yeah, I mean, they're, again, I think emphasizing they're probably going to be right there. Could be like a ginging to overtime or not that pushes it one way or another. And I think the next team, they're a tough one to gauge. Florida Panthers, point total 98 and a half, coming off a run to the Stanley Cup Finals, but also coming off an offseason where the cap started to catch up with them, and then injuries from that Stanley Cup run are also there, and they're going to be missing probably Aaron Ekblad and Brandon Montour, who are probably their best two defensemen at this point with the loss of Radko Gudas. They're going to be missing those guys for probably at least a month, maybe more.
Yeah, I think looking at their defense, it's Gustav Forsling that appears to be their top defenseman, pretty much, from at least a production point perspective. That's really concerning. Let's say it's even a month or two, and that's not a knock on Forsling. It's more just he's, I think, a good second pair guy, and he might need to be relied on as your number one for a month or two. And to be completely honest, that defense, I think with everyone healthy, it's decent. With Ekblad and Montour out, I think it's a little scary, especially in front of the two goalies that they have.
Yeah, I mean, saying Gustav Forsling as the number one defenseman out loud that's startling. It's really not a knock on the Panthers what they did. They did what they kind of had to. But this is what happens when your legitimately top two defensemen are injured. Is you have a guy is everyone has to get pushed up in the lineup. So Forsling's there are three, which is absolutely fine in normal circumstances. Who's now up to number one? But Brodsky had a great playoffs. Can he keep that momentum and steam going at age 34? That's a question. Anthony Stolarz he's an interesting backup idea. I'm not completely out on him, but I'm also not counting on him coming in and stealing games. I mean, him and Alex Lyon to me are basically the same type of goalie. I think that the question is hopefully Spencer Knight is improving mental health wise. He's been in the player assistance program, and hopefully he's back on the ice, and that could make a difference for the Panthers. And then even up front, they lost Anthony Duclair, brought in Evan Rodriguez, which I think is not a net negative, maybe a net positive, maybe break even.
I honestly think I kind of like that. I think Evan Rodriguez is the better all around player. So I don't necessarily mind kind of that change. I think forward wise, when I look at the Panthers, I'm content with where they're at. Um, they've got their higher end players, and they've got some pretty decent role players in the bottom half of the forward group. Um, and honestly, there's not a whole lot going on with their forwards as far as injuries or uh, big space kind of glaring. I guess they could use maybe a more definitive top six winger still, but the top of their lineup is still very, very strong. That I think whether it's Luster-Reinen in that role or maybe Rodriguez is up there, um, they're going to be just fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question mark for me is Verhaeghe a consistent 40-goal scorer? I don't know if there's a level of regression there. Is Tkachuk gonna play? I mean, there's no reason to doubt he plays at the same level. Do worry a little bit about maybe a lingering injury issue from the playoffs with his shoulder.
Yeah.
No major question mark there. But I think the kind of like we talked about, where's the improvement coming from the Sabres? Where's the improvement or at least offsetting the injuries and stuff coming from the Panthers?
So to me, there's one player, and that's Anton Lundell. Which where this becomes tough is he's penciled in as the third line center. Sam Bennett is, if you're going to put together a lineup for the Panthers, he's your second line center. I don't think he's written in that role in pen. I think it's pencil. But that's where I think they start the season. So Lundell is going to really have to show a clear step forward with his play to kind of unseat Bennett and take over that second line center spot. And I think that's really where the improvement is going to come from. I think Sam Bennett can pretty much be just about that 40-point player, whether he's on the second or third line in Florida. Anton Lundell was 33 points in 73 games. He's 21, former first rounder. I will say a very good underlying number player. And at that stage in his career, I would almost expect a step forward. So I think that is where the improvement comes from on this roster.
So I guess if I'm staking a claim over under, even with all that said, they're going to get off to a slow start. Let's be honest there. Like, I don't know if their defense holds up. Like, they could be battling out of a hole. Last year, they were frankly lucky to sneak in. I don't know if I see them getting to that 99 points. I don't see them getting there. I think I feel pretty comfortable saying the under here.
Yeah, I'm going to say the under as well. I think it is much more of a conversation if Montour and Ekblad are not hurt, but they're going to miss some time. It's going to be difficult for the Panthers because of that. So at 98.5 for an over under, I'm under as well.
So another team with some question marks that I think we both are going to lean under with, the Boston Bruins. They still have David Pastrnak, still have Brad Marchand, still have Charlie McAvoy, still have Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman. They don't have a center. Well, they do, but they don't have a true first line or second line center.
So I actually thought for a very split second there when I heard you say, and they still have Charlie, I thought you were going to make a joke that they still got Charlie Coyle. Because Charlie Coyle is their first line center. And he's really a third line center. A good third line center. moving past him, Pavel Zaka. Maybe he's a fringe second line guy. I think his overall points, uh, his point numbers might have been a little padded because of who else was on the team. So I'll specifically mention Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci, both retired, um, which is really why this issue exists. So there's Coyle, there's Zaka. They brought in Morgan Geekie as really their center addition, which I don't mean to uh, keep bringing this up, but it's just third line centers all over the place for the Bruins. There's another third line center. Um, so yeah, I think Coyle will produce more, just naturally if he's playing with Marchand and Pastrnak. I think the same could be said for Zaka if he's in that role. Whoever's in that first line role is going to have more points. They're going to look better than they actually are. At the same time, I think how strong Boston was down the middle when they had Bergeron and Krejci kind of made up for and almost hid the fact that they're not very deep on the wing, which becomes more glaring now that the center position is also a little bit of an issue.
Yeah, bringing JVR, James Van Riemsdyk, will help a little bit at this point in his career. He's probably a third line winger, power play specialist. I think I usually don't put a ton of stock in professional tryouts, PTOs, but they're bringing both Alex Chiasson and Danton Heinen in on tryouts, which could mean one or both of them end up on the roster. And Dan Heinen would be probably the type of player that this team, again, they need centers, but Heinen would be that type of winger at least that they could use to fill out depth a little bit. But I don't know. I don't know how much more can really be said with Boston. Like, they went all in last year, and they didn't raise that cup. And I mean, you start to feel the effect when you do that, and this is the consequences this year. I think this is almost a gimme. I don't like saying that betting wise because people saying the odds always know, but them not hitting 100 points just seems too obvious.
Yeah, I think if we just want to sit here and say where did they improve, I don't they didn't improve anywhere. Um, they basically have a pipe bursting with Bergeron and Krejci retiring, and they put duct tape over it. I think they can still make the playoffs, definitely. But nowhere on this roster did they improve this offseason. They actually got worse. And so, I mean, we've focused really heavily on the forward group. Defensively, I think they're going to be fine. It's relatively similar. They don't have Connor Clifton this year. They brought in Kevin Shattenkirk, which I think as a bottom pair guy, that'll be fine. I'm not too worried defensively. I want to mention the goalies. Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman probably had one of the best seasons that a goalie tandem has had just in hockey. I think they're both very good goalies. I just naturally I don't think that happens again. And I think they can still play at a high level and still not play as good as they did last year.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the overall, like, Boston was a record-setting team last year in the regular season. They were going to be due for a level of natural regression anyways. And then you take out two of their key pieces, and it could get, especially if someone gets hurt or something, like, this could get ugly, unfortunately, really, really quickly if a couple things go wrong. like I don't know the odds like I don't have that in front of me. I don't know the odds for them missing the playoffs entirely, but I don't think that would be, depending on how favorable those are. I don't think that's a crazy idea to sprinkle a little money there. Like I would feel better about doing that than, especially considering it'd be a little more favorable for me than some of even the like Sabres over under point total. And I mean it's tough if you're a Bruins fan, but they went in. They had the record setting season, but they just didn't get it done in the playoffs, and they're probably going to take a step back this year, just like the Florida Panthers did last year, and Florida didn't get worse roster wise like Boston just did.
Yeah, I want to give another example of some possible regression. Obviously, the goalies, I think, were at such a historic level. They're even they can still play very well and regress. A bright spot last year on the wing was Jake DeBrusk, 27 goals, 23 assists, 50 points in 64 games. Um, that was a pretty much a breakout season for him. Well, let's say that top line is Marchand, Coyle, Pasternak. Who's left for Jake DeBrusk to play with? There's no more Bergeron. There's no more Krejci. He probably has Pavel Zacha or Morgan Geekie as his center. And then the left winger is either Trent Frederick or James Van Riemsdyk. Those are all good role players. None of them are like good top six offensive players. So even if DeBrusk himself can play at a level like he did last year, I don't think the point production's going to be there just because of who his line mates are going to be. Unless he gets lucky and Boston decides to split up Marchand and Pasternak. Which they might almost have to just try it at some point during the season. I don't know. I that's my overall concern. That's one example, but the concern is they did not improve at all. They got worse.
Yeah, I again, I don't like saying easy money, but Boston under 100 points feels like I would say a smart or a savvy bet to place.
Under 100 and a half, so I mean they
100,
could get to 100.
they could get 100. Yeah, 100
so,
wins it, but
I mean just saying that though, I'm comfortable with that. They're 100 points or under.
yeah, and the other team in the division at that same level, 100.5 points, Tampa Bay Lightning. Again, I don't like saying easy money, but I think the savvy bet at this point is they're not going to get there. They didn't get there last season, and just like we talked about with Boston, they didn't really. I think they maybe stayed even. Killorn out. Jeannot in for a full season. Michael Eyssimont in for a full season. Connor Sheary full season. Well, Connor Sheary is a free agent. Are those offsetting Killorn? I'm not sure. Blue line is more and more of a question mark each year. And then it still comes down really to Andrei Vasilevsky, who with Jonas Johansson right now penciled in as the backup, is probably going to be playing the majority of the games again, and it seems like that needs to not happen for Tampa Bay to be successful over the course of the season.
Yeah, I agree. So Vasilevsky played 60 games last year, and I think that stretched him a little bit thin. Now the top goalies in the NHL, so the elite starters, you can sometimes expect to play 60 games, but I think what needs to be pointed out is with how good the Lightning have been over the past decade, really. Maybe not quite a decade, but pretty pretty close. With how good they've played a lot of games, so regular season and playoffs, and I think that probably started to catch up to Vasilevsky last year he was still a very solid goalie, but he wasn't quite that super elite guy that he once was. And we had mentioned in past podcast episodes, it would be really beneficial for them to find a real solid backup who could play, honestly, almost even close to a 1B role where he's playing 30 games, maybe 35 games. Jonas Johansson's not going to be able to do that. And honestly, if I think physically maybe he could do that, but the outcome is not going to be what they need it to be from a performance standpoint. That being said, I don't want to necessarily bring this up as a counter argument. I don't really know how I feel even about what I'm about to say. Looking at this division, initially we kind of see these top teams starting to get worse. So Boston they did not improve, they got worse. Tampa Bay, it's more of just they lose some pieces here and there, but just overall their elite core is aging. But then there's also the teams that are supposed to be up and coming and threatening the top teams. I'm honestly not like extra worried about what they did this offseason. So I mean, we've already covered those teams: the Buffalo Sabres, Ottawa Senators, Detroit Red Wings, the teams that everyone's kind of saying, well, these are the up and coming organizations. At some point, they're gonna really give Tampa a run for their money, Boston, Toronto a run for their money. I don't know. I think it's going to get harder and harder for Tampa Bay. I think this offseason overall could have been worse if the other teams in the division improved a little bit more when really they had opportunity to.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the interesting takeaway is people are thinking the Atlantic Division might be the best division in hockey. I don't know. I just what we've talked through, looking at their like these teams' rosters, there could be an opportunity for. I think Toronto's the clear number one at this point in the division. I think Montreal's probably finishing last. I know I started off this episode saying I'm not, like, maybe they're not, but I think you can make an argument for almost anyone, say Toronto being one, maybe Montreal not. Anyone else could finish second, third very easily. Like, again, I'm not a huge Detroit Red Wing fan right now, but they could do it. They could absolutely surprise and finish second because I don't think anyone's a true powerhouse behind Toronto, and even Toronto we'll talk about in a second has their level of question marks as well. But yeah, the Tampa Bay is probably fortunate that teams didn't maybe make the additions that they needed, but it's just looking at Tampa Bay's forward group now opposed to what I know it was a couple years ago when they were consistently 100 point team. I just don't know if they have enough with the age of who they still have to get to those 100 points. They didn't get there last year with a slightly younger and I think slightly better forward group, probably a little bit better defense goalie situation to me is the same. Yeah. Johansson could higher ceiling maybe than Elliott, but maybe also a lower floor. So who knows with that? But I just don't see Tampa Bay having done enough. So unless they really beat up on the other teams in the division, I would feel pretty good going under 100.5 points.
Yeah, so I guess I would kind of try and sum up what I had said in this way. I still lean under as well with the Tampa Bay Lightning, so under 100.5 points. At the same time, I feel when the offseason started, I was expecting to feel much more certain that they had no real chance at 100 points because I was expecting some of those other teams to improve a bit more than they did. Um, so I think Tampa is still under that 100.5. I do think that their chances to go over, though, did not decrease as much as they really should have. And that's a plus for that team.
So we've went long on this episode. We kind of gotten into some of these teams, but I think the clear number one team still in the Atlantic Division is the Toronto Maple Leafs, who say what we want. I don't love them swapping Dubas for Trevleving long term, but I think this offseason he did a fine job building out this roster. And I mean, looking at who they have, I think there's a little bit of a question on who's filling out your forward group to an extent. But Matthews, Tavares, Marner, Nylander, Bertuzzi, Domi is a really nice 6 names that I just read off. Matthew Knives, I didn't even read off. He should be right in that mix as well. So they have 6, 7 who should be top forwards that hopefully will be borderline elite for them. John Klingberg in on defense, that one's a little bit of a head scratcher, but they still have Morgan Riley, still have TJ Brody, Jake McCabe, Liljegren, Mark Giordano. Like, their roster's still good. Goals still, of course, a question mark, but Samsonov, Wall, with some Martin Jones thrown in, might be fine.
Yeah. So I like the forward group, at least the top half of it, or we'll say top 7. I think they did kind of well to bring in Bertuzzi and Domi on. I think in a way this was a positive for the team to have them in on 1-year contracts because it left open some flexibility moving forward, especially when guys like Marner, Nylander are going to need new deals. Matthews already signing his next contract. A little concerned about the depth. I think they have, honestly, their third and fourth lines, I think they're going to have filled with role players. I just would like to see a stronger third line from a team of their caliber. Defensively, I think kind of looking at how I believe it's going to play out, Jake McCabe is going to have to absolutely carry John Klingberg defensively. I say that with the expectation Brody and Riley would be together and Giordano and Liljegren. Or Liljegren. I apologize if I butchered that name. I think defensively they're overall solid other than Klingberg. I like the rest of those players fairly well. Touching on the goalies, like you kind of mentioned, there's question marks. Samsonov, he played like a number 1. Question is always going to be the health. At the same time, he only played 42 games, so they're going to need another half a season from either another goaltender or a handful of goaltenders. And yeah, Joseph Wall, maybe. I'd like to see him kind of become more of a regular presence as a backup or even a 1B, which I think could happen. Martin Jones is more of a performance-wise, not that great, but even at age 33, he can still give you the amount of games you might need, which is good. But I think for me, the questions for Toronto are really that bottom half of the forward group and then your goaltending. at the same time, in comparison to the rest of the Atlantic Division that we've gone over, the good things about Toronto are just better than the rest of the team's good things. So that top six, and honestly, the defense is pretty solid.
I think the question is with Toronto is 104.5 points. It feels like someone in the division has to, like, we've basically leaned under for everyone. Someone's going to have to take some points in that division, and it feels like Toronto's best poised to do so. So I think kind of if my other ideas and thoughts are correct, I think have to lean over a little bit, but like I don't confidently do so. But usually division winners are over 104. Well, really at least 105 points. So I lean the over just because process of elimination kind of gets them as the division winner at this point, and I just don't see how they finish with less than that if they win the division.
Yeah, so I will also say over. And I think at the end of the day, that top six is good enough to overcome the, I'll say bottom six, but really third line kind of lacking offensive ability. I think the wild card for Toronto is going to be the goaltending. And for me at this point, it's honestly, I believe Samsonov can be good enough as their number one. It's whether or not he's healthy. And I think if he stays healthy in this division, they shouldn't have a problem hitting that over. But if something goes wrong in goal, he gets hurt, that all of a sudden becomes really questionable getting to that 105 points.
I would say if you're kind of doing some fantasy with Toronto, you obviously want their top forwards. I'd keep an eye on where Matthew Knives is skating, like what line mates he's with early in camp, early in the preseason, because if he's going to play with Matthews and Marner, you want him on your team. If he's going to play with Tavares and Nylander, you want him on your team. Even if he's with Domi Bertuzzi, you want him probably on your team, but if it gets to a point where he's more with Yarncrook and like a Sam Lafferty, maybe you're not. You need to be a little more careful there that he might not put up the points that you're looking for. So if you're playing fantasy hockey, anything like that, I'd really pay close attention to Toronto's early lines. Obviously, lines change during the season, but it should give an indication of where they see Knives kind of slotting in, because someone's going to take that spot that Michael Bunting has had the past couple of years, and Michael Bunting put up points. And I love Matthew Knives' potential as a player, so if he's going to be there, I would have lots of shares of him.
Definitely, and I do want to say that that is something to really pay attention, see how the lineups are unfolding, because it would be great to see him in that spot of the lineup where Bunting was. But those two players that they brought in, Bertuzzi and Domi, could really play that same exact role pretty well next to the star players for Toronto. So I think they've really got three guys to fill the Bunting role. So that is really something to keep an eye on as the preseason gets underway and the beginning of the season, obviously. Watch Matthew Knies where he is in the lineup.
Yeah, my gut says Tyler Bertuzzi ends up there, kind of taking the role of Zach Hyman from a couple of years ago. But who knows? Again, watch those early lineups, because that could be a really savvy thing. Same with the Boston Bruins. See who's that first line center between, assuming Pastrnak and Marchand. Whoever that player is going to get points. So keep an eye on those. So yeah, those are kind of our look around the Atlantic Division here. Thoughts on point totals, thoughts on maybe a few fantasy hockey sleepers. If you have questions, thoughts, you want our opinion on someone, happy to provide them at AFP Analytics on Twitter. Our personal accounts are there as well. We appreciate you listening to the Max Term podcast on well, any major platform you might consume on, and please feel free to subscribe. We appreciate that as well. And next time we're going to start working on the Western Conference, so we'll talk to you then.